Hi, welcome back. Sifan O was a visiting research student here a couple of years ago. She stayed 13 months, and most of the work that I'll be presenting was by her. Unfortunately, she couldn't come. And Miriam Erez, who is from the faculty of management here at Technion, would have been here if we'd kept to the original timetable of tomorrow. But today she couldn't be here, so it's unfortunately my role to present the paper. And the presentation was prepared by Sifan. We got interested in the effect of team composition on creativity, which is another in design. Creativity is another one of those vague concepts. We've just mentioned this in passing this morning. So I'm not going to go into what is creativity at all. This would have lasted until the end of the conference, I think, if I did. But we used some well-known methods. We know from quite a lot of research in other fields that the composition of teams does have an effect on the creativity of outcomes. And generally speaking, it is a thought that mixed teams of different backgrounds are very, very conducive to creativity. Is that the fact? Is that the case also in design? The evidence so far in the literature is mixed. So we decided to experimentally test this. In our case, you see here that there are some positive implications to mixed design composition, and there are some negative implications. But most of this evidence comes from areas other than design. Design is a little bit different than some of the other areas, although, as we know, it's not that different than some of the other disciplines in which composition is the major task, some kind of composition. We asked the following: what would be the team composition that yields the highest level of team creativity in design idea generation? So we only looked at idea generation, not at a lengthy process. And in what order do the other two team compositions that we looked at, that is, teams composed of designers only and teams composed of non-designers only, how would they rank? In our experiment, the teams were actually dyads, that is, teams of two. And we had 18 such dyads. I'll call them teams, but you'll know that they are composed of two people. And they were randomly, within each composition, they were randomly matched. So we had 6 teams of designers only, 6 teams of non-designers only, and 6 teams of mixed, one designer and one non-designer. They undertook a small design task, really just idea generation. And the task, you'll see in a minute what the task was. And first they were asked to generate as many design ideas as possible and sketch them down. Then they had to select one of them and develop it a little bit further. And then they also were asked to give themselves a a grade, so to speak, of between 1 and 10. How creative did they think they were? Here are some examples, and you see under each example it tells you which type of team that particular dyad belonged to. And I should also mention that they were all the participants have volunteered. They were not compensated in any way. Oh, I think they got a little something, a pen or something. And it was a short task. And then the outcomes in the form of sketches were given to 3 judges who were experienced designers, and they were asked to give them to score them in terms of both novelty and usefulness, and also give them a sort of gut feeling, comprehensive creativity score. We also looked at a few other things, as you'll see in a minute. And the judges were convened one time before this started, and we looked at some of our experiment results, and we used that to just coordinate expectations as to how do you score each of the entries. So again, originality was one score that they gave. Usefulness was another, and also we asked them also to give a score for compliance with the requirements, because as it turned out, not everybody complied with the requirements. Then the researchers, we also looked at 2 other results. We gave them a rarity scale. In other words, we looked at the ideas that only came up once or twice in the whole set. Those were rare. And the fluency, which means the number of ideas generated. So we had the overall creativity score that was calculated by us, computed from the originality and usefulness. We had the fluency and rarity scores. We had the judges' independent gut feeling creativity scores, and we had the participants' own self-scoring and creativity. What did we find? This is what we found. As you can see, in almost all cases, leave alone the participants' own scores, the mixed teams scored the highest. Not all of the results were statistically significant. Significance is indicated by the blue lines. Yeah, reasonable. The differences were not enormous, but they did exist. Not so much on compliance with the brief requirements, but this was the least important one that we looked at. In particular, look at the differences in the judges' own independent creativity scores. Needless to say, the judges had no idea who belonged to what category of teams. And look at the participants' own scores. Of course, they are sky high, which I think is probably typical. And of course, we can explain the fact that we didn't get very many the significance wasn't high in terms of the p-value, because the sample was rather small. And there are some other limitations that we will look at the end. But here, you can see it also in terms of a graph. If it's clearer, same information. And here are the results for Fluency and Rarity. So here are some interesting things. If you look at Fluency, the number that's on the right here, Fluency, the designers had more ideas than the other teams, by quite a bit. And if you look at Rarity, the mixed teams came up with more unique ideas than the designers, and at the end, the non-designers, who unfortunately lagged behind in all of our scores. But this reinforces the results that we got from the judges. So this is not scored by the judges, it's just a count that we made. We had, we won't go into this here, but in the paper you'll see that we, to calculate Rarity, we had a fairly intricate mechanism how to by features of the solution to calculate this. I didn't mention, I mean, you saw the pictures. The task was to design a desk lamp made out of bamboo. And the only other thing that you could use was wire, of course, a lamp, an electric bulb, and glue. The findings, just to summarize, I'll just read this. The first finding is that non-designers conformed less to the requirements than did the other groups, but they boasted much higher creativity self-scores than the others. And our interpretation is that non-designers had lower awareness of design norms than designers. Designers were represented in the mixed teams, and therefore the scores for the mixed teams reflected the fact that these teams included designers. The second finding is that the mixed teams also scored highest on almost every creativity measure, with the exception of Fluency and creative self-scores, as we've already seen. And the interpretation is that non-designers in the mixed teams enriched creativity. But when you couple that with the designers who bring in their own professional skills, you get, at the end, both more original designs and more useful ones. Oops, we already saw that. Sorry, sis. What's going on? Yeah, we were here, right? I just went to the wrong order. No, we already had that, I think. Okay. Right. It is interesting that the originality and usefulness scores are of a very different nature. And if you look at the usefulness scores of the non-designers, who didn't do very well on the originality scores, but in the usefulness scores, they were very close to those of the designers. This is a very interesting result. So non-designers pay attention to usefulness because they understand, certainly in a case like a desk lamp, which is which the uses of are very clear to non-designers. There's no advantage in being a designer in regard to the usefulness aspect. But they pay more attention to it than the designers. The judges' independent scores, that is gut feeling, because they already gave a score for originality and usefulness, but then we asked them to give just a gut feeling for creativity. So they made no calculations, they just scored them, and we see that they are very close to the calculated scores for mixed teams and for designers, but for non-designers they were considerably lower than the calculated results. Why this happens? We're not sure, but one possible interpretation is that since the designers and hence also the mixed teams were able to come up with more complex ideas than those of the designers, the judges possibly had a high appreciation for the complexity of the ideas, and therefore they gave them higher scores. And in the case of the non-designers, where this complexity did not exist, or maybe they just didn't know how to sketch it, the scores were much lower. The fact that the participants' self-scores were so much higher than the calculated scores is a well-known fact, and there's even a name to it, which is called the self-serving bias effect. The unusually high self-assessment of the non-designers is a little bit surprising, because non-designers' metacognition, the perception of self-knowledge, is not accurate because they lack the professional criteria for evaluation. So what we conclude is that even in this small sample, it's really small, it's only 36 people, 18 dyads. Mixed teams showed superior creativity over other teams, and in that respect, therefore, design is no different than other fields in benefiting from disciplinary diversity in idea generation. So designers, myself included, are very often tend to think that designers are more creative than just about everybody else. It turns out that this is not exactly the case. The limitations of the study include the following. First, the sample size, I already mentioned that. The fact that we used dyads, the results may differ in the case of larger teams. In dyads, sometimes you get the situation where one person leads, is more dominant than the other, or easily more dominant than the other, and therefore the role of the second person is not as well represented as maybe it should be. So this is something to think about. The fact that this exercise was very, very brief and simple, and if the tasks were a little bit bigger and more complex, and the time span was longer, we could have possibly seen somewhat different results. We also should mention that the participants were very heterogeneous, and they didn't, for the most part, they didn't know each other in advance, and they were randomly matched, so this may also have an effect. The non-designers were, for the most part, graduate and postgraduate students of different Technion departments that are not related to design. Thank you very much.